This week in managerial accounting, we're going to focus on a topic that's called activity-based costing. The real issue here is understanding cost and recognizing that in many organizations and for many people, this is much more complex than it appears and is often elusive. That said, we should also recognize it is an essential skill in all organizations. It's essential because when we think about our main role in the world of managerial accounting, it's to help organizations and decision makers make the right or better decisions. And what are those business decisions that are being made, and how can cost help? And that's at the key of activity-based costing and why it's essential that we understand cost. Because there are so many key decisions that we make in all organizations where cost is a basis. This is true whether we're in a manufacturing, a service, retail environment. It's also true in a profit and nonprofit organizations. Every organization needs to understand the cost of certain things in their operation because they make so many key decisions based on understanding cost. And the reality is that there are many key decision makers and senior managers who don't understand cost, but yet make decisions as though they do. So why understanding cost is essential? Well, let's think about so many of the topics in categories where we'll use cost as a basis to make decisions. You know, we just covered this idea of break-even or cost volume profit analysis and desired profit. And understanding cost is what you could see was important there, understanding how to segment cost between fixed and variable. And so when we talk about pricing strategies, there are many organizations that use cost as a basis for price. So if we get cost right, then we make better pricing decisions. When we get cost wrong, as many organizations often do, then they're at a competitive disadvantage. When we assess the profit and loss of a product or a service, you know, that can be something like running a classroom or performing some kind of an operation in a healthcare entity. You know, we have to assess, are we making money or losing money in that particular operation, on that particular product? And so knowing cost is essential. And then, you know, we are also faced with issues like, should we make something or should we buy it? Should we add that product or should we drop it, add that service or drop it, you know, based on financial results? And then customers are often coming in and asking us for a discount on our product or service. So we need to understand, should we accept that special price or should we reject it? And it goes on from there. So what is essential that we understand is that understanding cost, knowing why it's important, and then knowing that we have a challenge understanding it in many organizations is at the heart of what we want to talk about this week. So what are the implications if we get costs wrong? Well, there are many implications. So one of the articles that I'm asking you to read this week is called Measure Cost Right, Make the Right Decisions. That grew out of a time period when U.S. industry was losing market share to Japan, and that was in the 1980s. And one of the key reasons it was determined that we were losing market share is that our costing systems were broken. And as a result, we were undercosting some products and overcosting others, and we were putting our firms at a competitive disadvantage. So knowing cost, when we get costs wrong, we by default open up the door to make bad decisions. And when we make bad decisions, that can be very costly to our firm and to our employees and to our customers. And conversely, when we have a good understanding of cost, then we provide better information to make decisions, and we put our firm in a stronger competitive position. And again, this is not just for-profit organizations. This is nonprofit organizations. This is manufacturing. This is service, and so forth. So when we talk about the major elements of cost, it's really pretty straightforward. There are three major elements of cost: direct material, direct labor, and overhead or indirect cost. So direct material are those costs that we can directly and cost effectively effectively traced to a cost object. So think about your smartphone that everyone carries around with them. What are the direct materials in there? Those are the items that, if I were building that smartphone, I could directly and cost effectively trace to the cost object. So I could look at the screen, the electronics inside, the microprocessor, the memory chip, etc., and I can figure out what parts go in there and what I pay for each part. Those are my direct materials. My direct labor are is the time and the cost of directly assembling or working on a particular product or service. So again, using the smartphone as an example, I could use the direct labor as the time people spend assembling the smartphone and the cost that I pay them. So those two items, direct material and direct labor, we need to do correctly, and those are the first steps in understanding our cost. Both in the traditional costing system and in activity-based costing, we take the same approach with direct material and direct labor. And we really haven't had a problem with either of those cost elements. Where we've had a big problem comes with this overhead and indirect cost. So, and when we talk about overhead and indirect cost, it's all the things that that are listed here, and perhaps some more. Management, administration. Think about how much it takes to run a large organization: IT, HR, human resources, quality assurance. Depreciation deals with the issue of, I buy equipment, I have to depreciate it, the taxes, insurance, engineering, etc. The facilities cost. So what you should recognize here is that when we talk about overhead and indirect costs, for many organizations, it's the lion's share of the cost. And so as this indirect and overhead cost has increased, it's created a problem for understanding cost, because unlike direct material and direct labor, where we can directly and cost effectively trace those to the cost object, overhead and indirect cost is a big challenge. Historically, we've taken an approach with overhead and indirect cost by lumping it all together and then assigning it based on one predetermined overhead rate. And that worked for a while until overhead and indirect cost became a much larger share of the overall cost structure. And then we recognized that that one simplified approach wasn't working, and we were getting cost wrong. And as I just established, when we get cost wrong, we open the door to make bad decisions. And that's at the heart of what activity-based costing is about. So to reiterate, why it's important are the things that we've already discussed: pricing, profit or loss of a product or service, resource allocation, make or buy, add or drop a segment. So you can easily see, even at this early stage in our course, why knowing cost and understanding cost is so important to every organization. So this invites, excuse me, the next question. How do we overcome the pitfall? How do we solve this problem? So activity-based costing and measure cost right. That article is really the foundation of the activity-based costing movement. So really, that's the beginning point that we should start our journey on understanding cost and getting cost right. But there are some other strategies too, right? So we want to make sure that we clearly understand the activities that are going on when we build a product or we have a service. And we want to have wide participation in the preparation. So the management accountant cannot do this alone. He or she has to sit down with everybody involved in the process: the purchasing people, the manufacturing people, the people that deliver the service, and understand what goes into making a product or service and what drives those particular costs. And then we need to understand our products and services in detail. And it's also helpful sometimes to have an independent review of our estimates. And then we want to update our estimates to reflect actual cost and changes. So let's not view this as a journey of perfection. Let's view this as a journey of continually improving, understanding things, and then being open-minded that things change. So who needs to know? Well, basically, anybody who's in a decision-making position, right? Executives, managers, investors, and key decision makers need to know and understand cost. Employees and task doers may also need to know as well. But at the end of the day, what we know is that most people, based on surveys that have been done on a continuous basis, really do not understand cost that well. And so there are key decision makers, executives, senior managers in all organizations who make decisions on a regular basis using cost as a basis, and they really don't understand cost. And if they're not getting the right cost, then by default, they run the risk of really making some poor decisions. And that's happened time and time again. So as I mentioned, when we cost is not right, then we end up with many risk situations. So when we talk about read, measure, cost right, they talk about the death spiral of bad data, right? So we can get into this whole death spiral. We can make a lot of bad decisions, and they tend to feed on each other. So we really need to place a key amount of energy into making sure that we have a framework for assessing cost. No one expects perfection. No one expects things to be right at the minute detail, but we should have a general understanding of how we arrive at cost. So we think about it in 3 steps: direct material, direct labor, and then we have this big pool called indirect cost. And then that's really where the challenge lies. How do we apportion those indirect costs to our cost objects? So measure cost right really is going to give us some really good insight in terms of how to do that. And then as you read through the activity-based costing chapter in the textbook, that will also be helpful. So to reiterate, bad information on products or services cost leads to a potentially bad competitive strategy. And if we have a bad competitive strategy, then it's really difficult to be successful, and we certainly open up the door for our competition. So the themes of activity-based cost, excuse me, think about how much products really cost to produce, focus on indirect cost. Okay, we need to also get direct labor and direct materials right. Okay, so let's take a look at traditional costing systems. So in traditional costing systems, the idea was that we would have a relatively simplified approach to costing. We'd do our direct material and direct labor, and then we would lump our overhead cost into one cost pool, and then assign that overhead cost into to each product or service based on the same rate. And unfortunately, this distorted cost information has caused a lot of problems. But it was based on the results of accounting choices made decades ago, when most companies focused on a narrow range of products, and their indirect costs were relatively inconsequential. So historically, the cost of direct material and labors were the most important functions, and these could and continue to be easily traced to individual products or services. But life has changed, and so as indirect costs has played a bigger role, we have to recognize that the traditional costing system just doesn't work, right? So the factory and corporate or indirect cost continues to rise because of technology and automation. And we need to think about a new approach in terms of how to assign that indirect and overhead cost to our cost objects so we can make better decisions. And based on what we're told in Chapter 3 and in Measure Cost Right and Make the Right Decision, existing costs or traditional cost systems frequently understate the profit on high volume products and overstate profit on low volume. So we want to think about activity-based costing. So the first step in designing a new product cost system is to collect accurate data on direct labor and direct material cost, okay? And that's true in the traditional costing system as well. The first step is always, let's make sure we know direct labor and direct material. And the good news here is that we've had a history of doing that well, and we can continue to do that going forward. So really, there isn't much that needs to be changed when it comes to direct labor and direct material. And in organizations where that's the lion's share of the cost, then activity-based costing is almost inconsequential. It's when we're in an organization where overhead cost is the lion's share of the cost that we really need to look at the activity-based costing issue. And if you think about healthcare or you think about higher education, the lion's share of the cost is an indirect cost, right? Look around at the campus, walk through a healthcare organization. It's all the indirect cost that is the vast majority of the total cost. And the question is, how do we determine the cost of an operation for a patient, a process, like phlebotomy, or what it costs to, for a physical exam, or what's it cost to run a program at a university or a classroom? And most of those costs are indirect costs. So the question is, what do we do about that? So what activity-based costing recommends is that we break out indirect overhead cost into the major categories and focus on the expensive resources, the 80-20 rule. And then look where consumption varies significantly by product or product type. So we're looking for diversity. And focus on resources whose demand patterns are uncorrelated with traditional allocation methods. Okay, so traditional measures were direct labor or direct materials. So we want to look for things that may cause the cost drivers to be different. So I'll give you a brief example. Let's say that we have two products, A and B, and we buy a new piece of equipment, very expensive, to help us with the new product B. So in the traditional costing system, we would take the total cost of the machine and we would allocate it to both A and B. But under activity-based costing, as we look and examine the cost of overhead, we're going to recognize that the cost of that new machine should only go to product B. And so it's a relatively straightforward process, which is we look at our major elements of overhead costs, we look at facility costs, we look at management costs, we look at depreciation, we look at facilities, IT infrastructure, and we look which products or services are you spending your time on, where are the resources going, and we align those costs and resources to the products or services that they're supporting. So what drove this new approach? So essentially, with technology and automation, we're seeing a decrease in the amount of direct labor usage and a significant increase in overhead cost. So it's now inappropriate to use a single plant-wide predetermined overhead rate because there's no correlation, right? So we're looking for that cause and effect. So activity-based costing helps us to solve that problem. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a vastly superior solution. And again, the major things are to take a look at our overhead cost, break out the major elements, and then look at how the products or services that we are making or delivering consume those resources, those indirect or overhead resources, and only assign cost to the product or service if they're actually utilizing those indirect or overhead costs. Okay, so there's some terminology about activity cost pools and cost drivers, which you can read through here. So that's an overview of our task and our discussion on activity-based costing. At the end of the day, the main message I want you to leave week 3 with is that we need to make sure that we understand cost, that we have a tool called activity-based costing, which can help us to improve our understanding of cost. And if we have a better understanding of cost, we're going to help the organization make better decisions.